Welcome back to Creepy Tales and Curiosities. My name is Aiden. Today, we will be diving into Wendigos and 3 disturbing true encounters. So, turn off the lights, sit back and join us, shall you?
Deep in the frozen wilderness of North America, there's a legend so horrifying it has haunted people for centuries. It's a creature born from desperation, hunger, and evil. A monster that doesn't just kill its victims, it consumes them. And worse, it was once human. This is the story of the Wendigo. The Wendigo comes from the folklore of the Algonquian-speaking tribes, which include the Cree, Ojibwe, and Innu. For generations, they've told stories about this creature, a malevolent spirit that roams the forests and tundras of the Great Lakes region in Canada. The Wendigo is often described as impossibly tall and emaciated, with sunken eyes, rotting skin, and a lipless mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. Its long clawed fingers stretch out like skeletal branches, and its body reeks of death. Some say its heart is made of ice, and wherever it goes, it brings an unbearable chill.
But the most terrifying thing about the Wendigo? It wasn't always this way. According to legend, the Wendigo is what happens when a person gives in to the darkest of temptations, when they eat human flesh to survive.
Imagine this. It's the dead of winter. You're lost, cold, and starving. Days go by and there's no food in sight. But you're not alone. There's someone else with you, another survivor. And at some point, when the hunger becomes unbearable, you make a decision, a choice you can never come back from. That act, the act of cannibalism, is said to be what transforms a person into a Wendigo. Once they cross that line, their humanity is stripped away, replaced by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. But here's the catch. No matter how much the Wendigo eats, it's never satisfied. Its hunger only grows.
The Wendigo isn't just a physical monster. It's also a spiritual one. The Algonquian tribes believe it's a force of greed and corruption, preying on people during times of desperation, especially in the winter months when resources are scarce. And it's not picky. It can possess someone, driving them mad, whispering dark thoughts into their mind.
The Wendigo isn't just a story. People even today claim to have encountered something out there, something that fits the description. And if you don't believe me, just listen to these real testimonials from people who say they've seen the Wendigo and lived to tell the tale. This story starts like any other hunting trip. A guy, we'll call him Dave, heads out into the woods late one night with his rifle, his gear, and a brand new thermal scope he's been saving up for. His target, wild boar. For those of you who don't know, boar are a massive problem in the US. They're destructive. They reproduce like crazy, and in many places you're allowed to hunt them without much restriction, even at night.
Now, Dave was a seasoned hunter. He knew what he was doing. He'd spent months researching the perfect spot, an area he'd scouted before, full of boar activity during the day, easy to navigate at night, and most importantly, remote. So, on a cool, quiet evening, Dave set out, confident this was going to be just another hunt.
The first few hours were uneventful. Dave tinkered with his new thermal scope, getting used to the settings, adjusting his aim, and occasionally spotting deer. But as much as he enjoyed the gadget, the night started to feel off. He noticed something strange. This area, which had been so lively during the day, was dead silent. No rabbits, no owls, not even the occasional rustle of leaves. It was just quiet, too quiet.
At around 2 a.m., just as Dave was thinking about packing up, he heard it, a crunching sound coming from the direction he'd originally entered. His heart jumped. Maybe this was it. Maybe it was a boar. He raised his rifle, peering through the thermal scope, and focused on the movement. At first, he thought he was looking at a bear, low to the ground, hunched over and moving slowly through the brush. But as he adjusted the zoom, his stomach sank.
What he saw was no bear. It was not a pig. It wasn't a deer. It was a man. This man was moving strangely. He was crouched low, his body twitching as he grabbed at the foliage, sniffing the ground, and palming the trees. Dave thought, maybe it's a game warden, but then realized that didn't make sense. They would have driven up with headlights, and this guy? He wasn't wearing any clothes, not even shoes. Dave kept watching, frozen in place. The man's movements were wrong. His body was jerky, twitchy, almost like an animal. And then it got worse. The man squatted down, planted his hands in the dirt, and looked straight up at the sky. His body was still, but his face was staring directly at Dave's tree. And then Dave heard it, a woman's voice claiming they needed help and that they were lost. The voice was coming from the man. For a moment, Dave hesitated. What the hell is this guy doing? He thought. Was this some sort of insane prank? Or was this guy seriously lost and out of his mind? But then the voice called out again, this time in a child's voice claiming they needed help and couldn't walk. Dave's confusion turned into a cold realization. He had seen this man walking, moving through the woods effortlessly. This wasn't a cry for help. It was a trap. Dave didn't wait to find out what was going to happen next. He grabbed his pack, scrambling to get his gear together, but when he glanced back through the scope, his blood ran cold. The man was still crouched, but now, his face was staring directly at Dave's position. And worse, he was smiling. Through the thermal scope, the man's eyes glowed white like an animal's. Dave screamed at the man, and for a moment the man didn't move. Then slowly he stood up. Dave realized just how tall and skinny this guy was. Easily over 6 feet, his body looked wrong. Long, stretched out like he was barely human. And then, without warning, the man dropped onto all fours and started sprinting towards Dave, faster than should have been possible. Instinctively, Dave fired a warning shot above the man's head, and it stopped him in his tracks. But instead of running away, the man crouched low in the grass, his glowing eyes barely visible above the brush. Dave aimed again, yelling at the man to stop immediately.
The two stayed locked in a terrifying standoff. Dave's hands were shaking, his heart pounding. Then, as suddenly as it started, the man bolted to the left, disappearing into the tree line.
Dave didn't waste a second. He ran to his truck, rifle in hand, and sped off into the night, the sound of that strange, haunting laughter, almost like a cry, fading behind him. For a long time, Dave convinced himself that it was just some deranged person living off the land. He reported the incident to Fish and Game, but all they did was scold him for hunting alone at night. But years later, when Dave told the story to his nephew, the boy's reaction made him question everything. His nephew told him about Wendigos, creatures from folklore that could mimic human voices and lure people into traps. Suddenly, everything about that night, the strange movements, the mimicry, the inhuman speed, took on a much darker meaning. Was it a Wendigo, or just a crazy man in the woods? Dave doesn't know, but what he does know is that he's never gone back to that spot.
And after hearing his story, I don't think I would either. Do you think it was really a Wendigo? What would you have done in that situation? Let us know in the comments below.
What starts as a peaceful road trip to admire the stars turns into a nightmarish encounter with something unexplainable. And the scariest part? It didn't end when the drive was over. This story comes from a man living in Ontario, Canada, not far from Toronto. Let's call him Matt. Matt had heard that the northern lights might be visible that night, and since he'd seen them back in May, he decided to head out solo this time. The plan was simple. Drive up to Algonquin Park, about 4 hours north, hike into the forest, set up a campfire, and stargaze. He wasn't too concerned when a friend texted him mid-drive, saying there was no real forecast for the northern lights. Stargazing was a hobby of his, and he figured it would still be worth the trip. But what Matt didn't know was that this drive, which started as just another solo adventure, was about to become the most terrifying night of his life.
By the time Matt reached the outskirts of the park, it was pitch black. No streetlights, no signs of civilization, just the narrow, winding road cutting through the dense forest. To pass the time, he called a buddy, chatting idly as he drove. The stars above were stunning, so much so that his friend suggested he pull over and take a few pictures.
Matt pulled over, left his car running, and stepped out into the frigid night air. He turned off his headlights to let his eyes adjust and stood by the edge of the forest, admiring the stars and gushing about how incredible they looked. For the first few minutes, it was peaceful, but then the forest went silent. Not just quiet, unnaturally quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, no distant howls. Just the sound of Matt's breathing and the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. He felt it immediately. Something was wrong. Gripping his flashlight, he stepped cautiously into the woods, scanning the area for signs of a bear or another animal. And that's when he saw it. About 50 meters ahead, something was standing on its hind legs, staring directly at him. Its eyes glowed with a strange orange-red light that pierced the darkness. At first, Matt thought it might be a bear, but as he watched, he realized this thing was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its stance too unnatural. It wasn't a bear, and before he could process what he was looking at, it bolted, sprinting straight at him at full speed.
Matt's instincts kicked in. He sprinted back to his car, throwing himself inside and slamming the door just as the creature closed the distance. He redlined the engine, pushing the car to its absolute limit, speeding down the road at over 100 miles per hour. But no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following him.
Matt started calling everyone he could think of, his hands shaking as he tried to explain what had just happened. When he finally reached his best friend, he sobbed uncontrollably, describing the creature and what had happened. And just when he thought he was finally getting away, it happened again. Out of nowhere, Matt's signal dropped, and the same creature appeared on the side of the road, its body contorted in a fetal position, but its head turned toward him, those glowing eyes locking with his. As he sped past, he heard an ear-piercing scream, like nothing he'd ever heard before. He drove faster, desperate to get away, but the sinking feeling in his stomach only grew. Something was still watching him. And then, the tapping started. Rhythmic, deliberate, like someone, or something, was trying to get his attention. Matt felt an overwhelming urge to open the sunroof and look, but somehow he resisted. He just knew, that whatever was up there, he couldn't face it. The tapping continued for nearly an hour, only stopping when he reached the lights of a small town. By the time Matt got home, he was physically and emotionally drained. He locked every door, every window, but even then he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he had seen was still out there, or worse, that it wasn't finished with him yet.
Luckily for Matt, he ultimately escaped unscathed. What do you think it was? Do you believe it was a Wendigo? Let us know in the comments below.
When you grow up in northeastern Pennsylvania, life revolves around the outdoors. Endless forests, sprawling fields, and small towns where everyone knows everyone. As a kid, you fish, you hunt, you build forts. As a teenager, you start bonfires, you hang out in the woods. And sometimes, if you're feeling brave, you explore places you probably shouldn't. This story comes from a guy we'll call Ethan. It happened when he was 13, on a summer night in June, during a birthday party for his friend Wyatt. There were 4 of them: Wyatt, Alex, Jordan, and Ethan. That night, they decided to do what every group of adventurous teenagers dreamed about back then: head into the woods, find an abandoned quarry, and see if they could scare themselves half to death. But what started as a simple night of teenage mischief would end in a horrifying encounter that left them running for their lives.
The plan was simple. Sneak out into the woods, hike 3 miles to the old quarry, and see what they could find. The quarry was abandoned decades ago and was rumored to be haunted. As the boys packed their gear, they joked around. Wyatt got roasted for wearing Vans instead of boots, and Alex, who always brought way too many knives, got teased for being the group's serial killer. It was all fun and games, but as they headed into the woods, Ethan felt something change.
The air got heavy. the kind of heavy that makes you feel like you're being watched. He tried to brush it off, but deep down, something didn't feel right. As they walked, Ethan started scanning his surroundings: maple trees, rocks, the occasional bird, and then bones. At the bottom of a small cliff, he spotted a freshly killed deer. Its flesh was torn apart, its bones picked clean, and its skull still dripping with blood. Ethan froze, imagining what could have done that. Maybe a bear? A mountain lion? He hoped it was nothing worse. Ethan shrugged it off, not wanting to freak anyone out, and the group kept moving. But that feeling, that weight in the air, it wasn't going away.
By the time they reached the first barbed wire fence, the tension was palpable. Ethan spotted a torn rag caught on the wire, but the boys pushed on, crawling under the fence and heading deeper into the woods. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong.
That's when he saw it. About 25 yards away, a long gray hand was wrapped around the trunk of a birch tree. Its fingers were unnaturally thin, its claws razor sharp. Above the hand, Ethan could just barely make out the edge of a head. But before he could get a good look, it disappeared. Ethan's heart was racing. He wanted to tell his friends, but he kept quiet, afraid they'd laugh at him. He told himself it was nothing, until they reached the quarry. The quarry wasn't what they expected. No mine shafts, no haunted ruins, just an old cow pasture. They climbed a small cliff, messed around, and took photos for Instagram. For a moment, it felt like everything was fine. But then they heard it. It was Wyatt's dad's voice, calling from the woods. But something was off. The voice was too quiet, almost mechanical, and the woods were over 100 yards away. The boys spun around, staring at the tree line. Ethan told the guys that they need to go, his fear rising. The others hesitated, but eventually followed. They scrambled back under the barbed wire fence, but before they could make it out, they heard a loud snap.
About 20 yards away, it stood. A 9-foot-tall humanoid creature, its gray skeletal arms reaching down to its knees. Its claws gleamed in the moonlight, and its teeth, jagged, yellow, and stained with blood, stuck out like a shark's. The boys froze, staring in disbelief, until the creature's eyes locked onto Ethan's.
That's when it moved. Ethan told them to run, and the boys took off. The creature let out a metallic, guttural roar and started chasing them, hurdling the barbed wire fence like it was nothing. Ethan felt its hot breath on his back as it closed the distance, roaring in rage. The boys reached a small cliff and jumped, landing hard on the ground below. Ethan twisted his ankle, but adrenaline pushed him forward. They sprinted through the forest, the creature right on their heels, its claws scraping against trees as it ran. And then, it stopped. At the edge of the forest, the creature stood, watching them. Its glowing red eyes locked onto Ethan as it croaked his name in a voice so distorted and unnatural, it barely sounded human.
The boys ran all the way back to Wyatt's house and locked themselves in his room, too terrified to speak. To this day, Ethan swears what he saw wasn't a bear or a wolf or anything remotely natural. He doesn't know what it was, but one thing's for sure, whatever it was, it's still out there.
What are your thoughts on their story? Do you believe this encounter? What do you think was really chasing them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. Also, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell for more true creepy tales. Stay safe, and until next time, my friends,